On an August evening in 1856, a small figure in black came home not by carriage and not in triumph, but on foot across the fields, alone, walking slowly up the long drive toward the great house in the failing light. There were no bands, no arches, no crowd waiting to receive her. She had refused all of that and traveled under another woman's name. And yet the slight, dark, solitary figure walking up that drive in the dusk was, just then, the most famous woman in the world. Everyone remembers the lamp. Almost no one remembers that the hospital she ran had the worst death rate of the entire war. A fact a powerful friend kept out of the official report, and that stayed buried for generations to protect her legend. She was not, in the simple way we are taught, the woman who saved them. She was the woman who could never stop counting how they died. Of the legend itself, of the lady and the lamp the whole nation had fallen in love with, she would one day write, very quietly, in a note meant for no one. The lady with the lamp shall stand, but the lamp shows me only my utter shipwreck. This is the story of what she did with that knowledge of the next 50 years. Most of them spent in a single darkened room, turning grief into arithmetic, counting the dead so carefully that the way a whole nation cares for its sick was, in the end, quietly rebuilt around her numbers. It is not the story of the angel of the legend. It is the story of the woman who refused to be one. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Tested God. Before any of it, the lamp, the legend, the war, there was a child who did not pray so much as test, who took the promises she had been handed and quietly held them up to the light to see whether they were true. She was born into 2 great houses and as many as 15 servants, into a comfort so complete it had almost the texture of confinement. There was Leah Hurst, high on the Derbyshire hills, kept for the summers, and Amberley Park in Hampshire, the larger house where the family truly lived. And because that was not quite enough, the household moved between the 2 of them and a 3rd establishment in London 7 or 8 times a year. A slow migration of trunks and carriages and servants that she came very early to hate. From the outside, it was everything a girl of her station could want. From the inside, to her, it felt less like good fortune than like a beautiful airlessness she could not name and could not leave. And yet, from about the age of 6, she felt herself set apart from the warmth around her, not quite of the same substance as other people. In a note she made about her own childhood, she called herself a monster, her own word, and described dreading the arrival of new faces, refusing even to come down and dine with the family for fear that she would handle her knife and fork wrongly and give herself away. While the house went on around her in its bright, ordinary business, she withdrew into what she later called a world of my own, peopled with visions. It would be easy to read this as mere shyness. It was closer to a child quietly suspecting that she had been made for some other purpose, and not yet given the smallest clue what it was. What she did, instead of joining the company, was count. As a small child, she cataloged things. She made careful collections of shells, which she polished one by one with oxalic acid, and of coins, and she tabulated whatever could be tabulated, ordering the world into rows and columns. Those who knew her noticed in her, very young, a passion for what one of them called neatness, method, and order. It looked, at the time, like the harmless tidiness of a serious little girl. It was, in fact, the first appearance of the instinct that would, half a century later, count the dead of an army and turn the counting into proof on the same hand. Reaching for the same kind of certainty, only the rows were still made of shells. And then there is the story that tells you, in a single childish gesture, who she already was. At about 6 years old, she did not simply believe in prayer. She tested it. She set herself a small experiment, naming a thing she wished to become and a date by which the prayer ought to have been answered. In her own recollection, by the 7th of July, I pray that I may be. And there she names the change she hoped for. And then, when the 7th of July came, I looked, and I was not. A child of 6 had quietly run a controlled trial on God, found that prayer alone, prayer without action, did not move the world, and this is the part that matters, did not lose her faith. She kept the hunger and went looking for a God who could be tested. The mind that ran that experiment was being fed by an unusual father. William Edward Nightingale taught his 2 daughters himself in what the family called the College of Two in the library. And with Florence, he taught as though she were the son the family did not have. She read Greek and Latin, Homer and Plato in her mid-teens, and rose sometimes at 3 or 4 in the morning to do it by candlelight in the cold. But the one subject she truly wanted, she had to plead for. Mathematics was not, in that house and that age, considered necessary for girls, and she had to argue her way to it. The mind that would one day run 2 royal commissions and master a country she never saw was forced here, in a pre-dawn library, against a quiet ceiling it was never quite allowed to forget. Because for all that learning, the shape of her life had been decided before she could read it. The family estate was entailed, and there was no son to inherit it. The property was bound to pass, instead, to her father's sister and her sister's boy. And so the verdict was spoken plainly over her, in the way such things were set then, without cruelty and without doubt. It would have been better, the family agreed, if Florence had been a boy. As a baby, the people round about, for want of a male heir, had even taken to calling her the young squire. It was the period's casual sentence on a clever girl. The whole of the rest of her life would be, among other things, a slow and complete overturning of it. And then, into that contradiction, the trained mind with nowhere to go, the thing arrived that she would spend the rest of her life answering. On the 7th of February, 1837, she recorded that God had spoken to her and had called her to his service. She did not describe a feeling or a mood. She described, quite carefully, an objective external voice, a thing that had happened to her from outside, and she likened it, with no false modesty, to the voice that had called Joan of Arc. There is a small, honest wrinkle in the record. One careful modern editor dates it a day or 2 earlier, to the 5th of February, and it is worth leaving the discrepancy standing rather than smoothing it away. But the date is not the difficult part. The difficult part is that the voice called her to his service and did not say to what. The call, having come, had nowhere to land. For 3 months afterward, she worked, in her own phrase, very hard among the poorer people, under what she called a strong feeling of religion going out among the cottagers and the sick of the neighborhood, doing what good a gentleman's daughter could do with no training and no profession to pour it into. It is a tender, almost helpless picture. A young woman, absolutely certain that she has been summoned to something, and reduced, for want of any vessel her world will permit her, to charity rounds in a Hampshire village. The will was entirely present. The channel for it did not yet exist. That gap between a vocation she could not doubt and a vocation she could not name is the whole of what comes next. One last thing about that February day, because it tells you how she carried it. The call was not, for her, a single event she remembered fondly and moved on from. It became a structure she lived inside for the rest of her life. By her own later account, her voices spoke to her 4 times across her years. In 1837, the first call. Then, in 1853, before she took her first real post. In 1854, before the Crimea. And in 1861, after the death of the man she would come to call her master. And the 7th of the month, the day of that first call, held, in her private calendar, a hallowed position, a recurring day of reckoning on which she stopped and examined herself against what she had been called to do. She built a quiet, lifelong liturgy out of a single morning, and she kept it. Chapter 2. O weary days. The call had come, and then, for 17 years, nothing came to answer it. For most of 17 years, the days were the enemy. She was a young woman of fortune in a house that wanted for nothing, and what she felt, hour by hour, was the slow weight of having nothing to do that mattered. She left her own record of it, and there is no kinder way to read it than the way she wrote it. O weary days, O evenings that seem never to end. For how many long years I have watched that drawing room clock and thought it would never reach the 10. That is the whole decade in a single sentence of first-class mind, in a warm and beautiful room, watching a clock and willing the hands forward, certain the evening would never end. The comfort that surrounded her was total, and the comfort was the cage. And yet the will did not die in that room. It went underground. In the hours before the household woke, she taught herself the thing that no one would teach her. She rose in the cold and the dark, wrapped in a shawl, and wrote by candlelight, filling notebook after notebook, tabulating the government, blue books, and the hospital reports that friends abroad sent her, copying out figures on sickness and death and the cost of care. It looked, to anyone who never saw it, like nothing at all. It was, in fact, the foundation of the vast and detailed knowledge that would one day make her the first authority on hospitals in Europe. The expert was being built in secret, alone, by the light of one candle, years before there was any work for her to be expert at. There is one small detail that holds the whole of it. She kept a watch on the floor, just inside her door, and each morning she sprang up and seized it before her maid could come in, so that no one would catch her at her studies, and so that her one private hour could not be smashed. Think of what that asks of a person, to guard your own mind like contraband in your own father's house against the people who love you. The freedom she had was the few stolen hours before the others rose, and she defended them on the floor by the door every single morning for years. In the daylight, the same mind was put to other uses, She ran the still room at Embley, the preserving and the storing of the household's food. And she ran it, as one account has it, surveying 56 jam pots with the eye of an artist. It is almost a joke, and she would not have laughed. The intellect that would one day move armies and reorganize a subcontinent was, for now, counting jars of preserves and accounting for them to the penny, because that was the only ledger a daughter of the house was permitted to keep. The waste of her sat there on the shelf, in neat rows, sweet and pointless, gathering the light. Once, near the end of 1845, she made a real bid for a way out. She would go and train as a nurse at Salisbury Infirmary, under a family friend, a modest, careful plan, made by a woman of 25, who already knew exactly what she was for. The house broke over it. Her mother was terrified. Her sister Parthenope had hysterics. Her father, cold with disgust, dismissed the whole idea as vanity and selfishness. And the real objection was, no one would say to her face that the nurses of that day were known for drunkenness, and worse, that a hospital was no place a lady could enter and come out unspoiled. So the plan was simply forbidden, and she stayed. It is worth holding that fact alongside everything she later became. The disreputable, half-ruined trade her family would not let her touch is the very thing she would, in time, rebuild into a profession a respectable woman could be proud of. And so it went on, and the despair in her private notes goes deeper than anything a stranger would guess from the comfortable life. Oh, for some great thing, she wrote, to sweep this loathsome life into the past. And, plainer still, the line that marks the floor of those years. In my 31st year, I see nothing desirable but death. This is how near she came to extinction inside her own good fortune, not from want, not from grief at any single loss, but from the slow suffocation of a great capacity with nowhere to go. Let it stand without comfort. She meant it. There had been, all this while, a way out that the world would have called the happy ending. Richard Monckton Mills, poet, reformer, the man she herself called the man I adored, courted her for the better part of 9 years. She did not refuse him because she felt too little. She refused him because she felt too much and had thought it through with a terrible clarity. She had, she wrote, an intellectual nature that required satisfaction, and a passional nature, and an active, moral nature that would not find its satisfaction in his life, and voluntarily to put her work out of her own power would seem to her like suicide. On the 7th of June, 1849, she gave him his answer and let the man she loved go. It is the cleanest proof of what she was. A woman who would surrender almost anything before she would surrender the work she had not yet even been allowed to begin. A year later, on her 30th birthday, far from home in Athens, she wrote the vow that sealed it. Today I am 30. She wrote the age, she noted, at which Christ began his mission. Now no more childish things, no more love, no more marriage. Now, Lord, let me think only of thy will. It is not a bitter line, and it should not be read as one. It is a consecration. A woman setting down, deliberately, the ordinary happinesses other people are allowed, and turning what was left of her toward a purpose she could still only feel and not name. And then the wall gave way. In 1851, she went at last to Kaiserswerth on the Rhine, a plain Protestant institution where deaconesses ran a hospital and an orphanage and a school, women doing the work, free of vows and cloistered cells. It was the only real training she would ever have, and she had to fight her own family to the edge of violence to reach it. The night before she finally left, her sister threw her bracelets in her face, and the scene was so savage that she fainted. She went anyway, and there, among the sick and the dying, doing the Spartan, exhausting, ordinary labor she had been forbidden for 17 years, she wrote the words that closed the long captivity. This is life. Now I know what it is to live. The clock had reached 10 at last. After 17 years of watching it, she had simply got up and walked out of the room. The call had been waiting 17 years for somewhere to go, and now, all at once, it had found a war. What it found her doing there was not what the engravings would later show. In the autumn of 1854, a man named William Russell, the first war correspondent there had ever been, sent home dispatches to the Times that did something dispatches had never quite done before. He did not describe the fighting. He described the hospital the wounded laid down without even linen to make bandages, the sick left to a squalor no one at home had imagined was being done in their name. And a reader, reading it over breakfast, wrote in to ask a single question that would not let go. Why have we no sisters of charity? Sidney Herbert was, just then, Secretary at War. Her friend, who had long believed she might be the one person in England who could do this. On the 15th of October, he wrote to her, asking her to go out to Scutari in command of a party of nurses at the government's expense and to treat it soberly as a test. If this succeeds, he wrote, a precedent is established which will multiply the good to all time. The strange thing is that she had already offered. Her own letter, written the day before his, was traveling toward him as his traveled toward her. They crossed in the post. There is one small thing from the days of packing that is worth keeping, because it tells you more about her than the dispatches do. She had a pet owl, Athena, rescued years before from boys at the Parthenon, who rode in her pocket and went everywhere with her. In the rush of leaving it, was shut up in an attic and forgotten, and when it was found, it was dead. Poor little beastie. She wrote, it was odd how much I loved you. That was the only sign of feeling anyone recorded in her on the eve of departure. Not for the war, not for the men she had never met, for a small dead bird in her hands. The tenderness was real, and it was strangely placed. You will see that pattern again. They left London on the 21st of October, 1854. 38 women, 14 Anglican, 10 Roman Catholic, 14 hired secular nurses, bound for a place most of them could not have found on a map. The barrack hospital at Scutari stood on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, directly across the water from Constantinople. A great square, former Turkish artillery barracks, requisitioned for the overflow of a war being fought hundreds of miles further on in the Crimea. It was a long way to send a question about whether women could nurse soldiers. They went the whole length of the Mediterranean to find out. She reached the barrack hospital on the 4th of November, 1854, and walked into a scale she had no measure for. The Battle of Inkerman was fought the very next day. The wounded came in by the 100, 400 landing as she arrived. Sometimes 700 sick put ashore in a single batch. Inside, the wards ran on and on into the dark in what she called 4 miles of beds. Pallets laid 18 inches apart, each man given about a quarter of the air a body needs. 38 nurses, and something past 3,000 patients. Better than 80 men to every woman. You can read those numbers as administration, and in the end, she would. But standing in the doorway of it that first night, there was nothing to do with the magnitude, except feel how small any one person was against it. What she could not see that first night was the real enemy, because the real enemy was the building itself. The barrack hospital had been raised over an open sewer, with a cesspool beneath it. A dead horse lay rotting in the water pipe. More than 25 dead animals were found on the site, and sewage seeped quietly into the tanks the man drank from. Water was rationed to a pint a head a day. Her own party of 40 was crammed into 6 small rooms, one of which still held the corpse of a dead Russian general left there for days. The War Office knew the building was poisoned. It had been reported months before. She did not. And so it was disease, not wounds, that filled those beds across the whole war. Roughly 19,000 men would die of illness against some 4,000 of their injuries. Hold on to the building. Everything she did for the next 50 years began as an answer to it. Her answer, that first winter, did not look like nursing at all. It looked like supply. There were almost no clean shirts. 6 or 7 had been washed in weeks before she came, so she set up a laundry, paid for out of the fund the Times had raised. There were no scissors, she noted, for cutting the man's hair, which is literally alive. She became, in her own dry words, cook, housekeeper, scavenger, washerwoman, general dealer, storekeeper, a kind of general dealer, she wrote, in socks, shirts, knives and forks, precipitate for destroying lice, scissors, bedpans, and stump pillows. In 2 months, she purveyed something like 6,000 shirts, 2,000 pairs of socks, operating tables, screens, going down to the stores almost every day to drag out by sheer will what the Army's own clerks had locked behind a board of survey. This is the part the legend leaves out. Her compassion did not arrive as a feeling. It arrived as a laundry, a store cupboard, and a fight over forks. When a wing of the hospital was damaged by fire, leaving some 800 wounded men with nowhere to go, she did not wait for permission. She engaged 200 Turkish workmen and rebuilt it on her own responsibility, paying for part of it out of her own pocket. She later called it the most important thing she did out there. A scandalized colonel named Sterling caught the audacity of it in a line. Miss Nightingale coolly draws a check. Is this the way to manage the finances of a great nation? It was, as it turned out. Her spending was examined, approved, and every penny refunded. The will that knelt by dying men was the same will that signed for the building over the heads of the men who were supposed to sign, and was, in the end proved right. And the lamp, because the lamp is real and worth getting right. The image the whole world would keep is of a slender figure gliding the wards with a tall, glowing genie's lamp held aloft. The actual object was humbler and somehow better. A folding Turkish lantern called a fanuz, a collapsing concertina of waxed linen around a single candle, the sort of thing you could carry up a dark stair and set down to free both hands. The grand engraving that fixed the legend appeared in the Illustrated London News in February of 1855, and the picture in it was largely invented. The truth she recorded herself, and it is more painterly than any print. The night scenes, she wrote, are quite Rembrandt, not a halo of light, a single candle in waxed linen, and a great deal of dark. So here is the true night round, the thing under the legend. By one estimate, she sat at some 2,000 deathbeds that winter kneeling, sometimes for as long as 8 hours, to dress a single wound, with what an observer called an utter disregard of contagion. She wrote letters to the mothers of dead soldiers, the first time any official voice had thought the bereaved worth the trouble. And the men, who had no reason to love anyone in that place, loved her past sense. One of them said the thing that outlived all the rest: we could kiss her shadow as it fell. Keep that. Keep the kneeling, the 8 hours, the shadow on the wall, because it was real and it was not nothing. We will come, soon, to the harder fact that for all of it, the men in her hospital were dying faster than anywhere else in the war. But she earned the tenderness before she earned the reckoning, and so will we. Chapter 4. A lady in black, walking alone. She came home not in triumph, but in hiding. And the woman who stepped down from the boat was not the angel of the prince, but someone the war had hollowed out and would not let go. In May of 1855, she crossed at last to the Crimea itself, to the camps above Balaclava. And within days of her 35th birthday, the war very nearly took her. She collapsed with what they called Crimean fever, lay close to death for the better part of a fortnight, her hair cropped short against the heat of it, and was carried down the hillside in a litter by 4 guardsmen, while the men she had come for watched her go. When they tried to send her home to England to recover, she refused. If she left, she said, all of it would go to pieces. They got her aboard the ship only against her will, at the risk of her life. She would not save herself ahead of the work, and something in that refusal, the body counting for nothing against the cause, was the whole shape of what she would become. And here the story turns on a fact she herself never hid. The great fall in the dying did not come from her nursing. It came in March of that year, when a sanitary commission arrived and went down into the foundations of the place, flushing the choked sewers, clearing the cesspool, lime-washing the fouled walls, carting away in the first fortnight alone 556 loads of filth and the carcasses of 24 animals. The death rate dropped sharply after that, and after that work, not before it. She had not drafted the order and had not got it sent, and she would later say plainly that on the true cause she had been, all that winter, in the dark. She stayed to the end of it, longer than any glory required. Peace was proclaimed in 1856, and she remained until the very last patient had left the barrack hospital that July, providing for every nurse going home, determined that no one of them be thrown off, as she put it, like an old shoe. She herself went without rations for 10 days and lived in a springless, hooded baggage cart that jolted her down those broken roads, the most famous woman in the war, finishing it in a supply wagon, because the work of seeing the living safely home mattered more to her than her own comfort ever had. When she came back to England, she came back as no one. She traveled under her mother's maiden name as Miss Smith, and she turned down everything they offered her. The man of war sent to carry her home, the bands, the triumphal arches, the whole apparatus of welcome a grateful nation had built for its heroine. She wanted none of it. Those who saw her described not a woman returning in honor, but a woman bereaved, a woman haunted. And the refusal was not modesty, arranged for effect, but the first sign of a withdrawal that would last the rest of her life. And so we arrive, at last, at the image the hour began with. On the 7th of August, 1856, she slipped home on foot across the fields, alone, and came up the long drive to the house in the failing light, and the housekeeper, looking out, saw a lady in black walking alone up the drive, and shrieked and ran out to her. Afterward, she said only that the mistress had come in like a bird. There were no crowds and no lamp. There was a small dark figure crossing the gravel at dusk. The most famous woman in the world, arriving home as quietly as grief comes home, and going without a word of welcome in. This is the picture to keep, truer than any engraving of the ward. Not the angel descending among the beds, but the lady in black, alone, walking up the drive toward the dark, going in to begin. Inside that quiet house, she wrote a private note that explains the 50 years to come. "Oh, my poor men," she wrote, "who endured so patiently. I have been such a bad mother to you, to come home and leave you lying in your Crimean graves." And then, in the same breath, the arithmetic that her grief could not stop reaching for. 73% she set down, in 8 regiments, in 6 months, from disease alone. The figure was her own, a cry rather than a verified rate. The same disaster she elsewhere framed another way, but that is the point of it. She mourned the dead by counting them. The grief and the number arrived together, fused, in one hand, on one page. What she did with that grief, she also wrote down, and it reads less like a sentence than like a vow taken at an altar. "I stand," she wrote, "at the altar of the murdered men, and while I live, I fight their cause." Her deepest feelings, those nearest her would say, lay not with the living, but with the dead, and from that strange, unmovable loyalty came everything that followed. She had decided how she would carry the men she could not save. She would not weep for them. She would spend the rest of her life proving why they had died. The vanishing after that was deliberate. She never again made a public appearance, never attended a public function, never issued a public statement. Within a year or two, many supposed she was dead. She destroyed her own fame, as one observer put it, deliberately, as a matter of policy, and the few letters she still troubled to answer went not to the great and the titled, but to humble people, to country parishioners and Sheffield cutlers and Newcastle workingmen. The most famous woman in the world drew a quiet door closed behind her, and on the far side of it, in a single curtained room, she began the longest and least seen work of her life. Now the grief becomes proof. This is the chapter in which she takes the thing she could not bear and turns it slowly into evidence. In September 1856, a month after she had walked up the drive alone, she was at Balmoral in a plain Highland room talking to a queen. The audience lasted more than 2 hours, and she spent almost all of it not on the wars or the lamp or anything the public wanted to hear, but on army reform, the defects of the military hospitals, laid out one after another, quietly and without mercy. Prince Albert wrote in his diary that they were much pleased with her, that she was extremely modest. The Queen put it differently. "I wish we had her at the War Office," she said. And that single sentence, from the one person in England no minister could ignore, was worth more than every figurine and ballad together. Florence took her own measure of the meeting too, in the cool, appraising way she took the measure of everyone. The Queen, she decided privately, was the least self-reliant person she had ever known. She had come home a haunted woman, and within a month she was already moving the sovereign of an empire, gently, in the direction she wanted her to go. A fortnight later, she turned the same force on Lord Panmure, the Secretary for War, a vast, slow, immovable Scot. The others called the Bison for his great head and his habit of lowering it and refusing to move. She wanted a royal commission on the health of the army, and she wanted it framed to her own design. By the end of the interview, the Bison had been, in a friend's astonished phrase, fairly overcome. "They found him," he wrote, "with his mane absolutely silky." She left with her commission promised, and shaped to her own suggestions. Not a body that would investigate a war in general, but one aimed, like a lens, at exactly the thing she meant to prove. It is worth pausing on the picture. A slight woman of 36, who described herself now as an invalid, sitting across a desk from one of the most powerful men in the government, and walking out with the instrument she needed clasped in her hand. She had no vote, no office, no public platform she would consent to use. She had facts and a will, and she had learned that the two together were enough. She would not, however, sit on the commission, or testify before it in person, or let her name appear at its head. That was the method she had begun to settle into, and would keep for 50 years. Power exercised entirely through paper, from a room no one was allowed to see into. She chose the commission's members herself, packing it quietly with her allies. She made Sidney Herbert its chairman he was. She said the mainspring of the whole thing, and then she ran the mainspring. She wrote out the questions the witnesses should be asked. She coached Herbert's cross-examinations. She sent him notes 2 and 3 times a day, a steady current of instruction flowing out of her room and into the public proceedings, while she herself stayed behind the curtain, invisible. Her 30 pages of written evidence were the only part of her the commission was permitted to meet. Everything else arrived as correspondence, and the correspondence governed it. And then she wrote the book. The confidential report on the health of the British Army ran to something between 800 and 1,000 pages, and she wrote it in 6 months while running the commission and paid for the printing out of her own income. There is no comfortable way to picture the labor of that 1,000 pages of close argument and tabulated death, set down by one person in half a year, in the intervals of governing a royal commission by post. She did not do it for a fee or for office or for any reward the world could see. The world, she had decided, would not even be allowed to read it. She did it because the men were dead and the cause of their deaths was knowable. And to her, those two facts together made the writing not a choice, but a debt. Inside 1,000 pages was a sentence that did not read like statistics at all. She had found that in time of peace, with no war anywhere near, soldiers in their own barracks were dying at 17, 19, and 20 in every 1,000, roughly double the rate of the civilian men around them, though the army took only the fittest, the picked lives, to begin with. And she refused to let that figure stay a figure. To keep such a mortality in peacetime, she wrote, was as criminal as it would be to take 1,100 men out upon Salisbury Plain every year and shoot them. Our soldiers, she said, enlist to death in the barracks. She had taken a column in a table and turned it into a firing squad on an open plain, and she had done it on purpose, because she had understood something most of her contemporaries had not, that a number by itself moves no one, and that the whole art is in making the number be seen. To understand why she could speak of dead soldiers and the will of God in the same breath, you have to know what she believed counting was for. She was a genuine mystic. The Catholic mystics were on her shelves, and she could write that God was to be found nowhere but in herself. And yet, she had no patience at all for the prayer that asks and does nothing. You pray against plague, pestilence, and famine, she said, and you won't do a single thing to alter the conditions that bring them. For her, the world was not a place of miracles to be begged for, but a place of laws to be discovered, laws as fixed and as holy as Scripture, written into the death rates and the drainage and the air. God governs by His laws, she wrote, but so do we when we have discovered them. To find out how the men died, then, was not a cold exercise set against her faith. It was her faith. A table of mortality was a page of the mind of God, and to read it correctly and act on it was the only form of worship she finally trusted. For the proof to convert, it had to be seen, and so she found the one collaborator who could help her make seeing inevitable. William Farr was the great medical statistician of the age, and she revered him. She called him her patron saint, and said that beside him, she felt like a small boy writing to Aristotle. Together, they built the diagram that is the truest portrait of her mind that survives. It is a ring of wedges, one for each month of the war, the area of each wedge swelling with the deaths of that month, and within every wedge, the deaths are split by color. A small inner core for the men killed by their wounds, and around it, vast, a great blue field for the men killed by disease, by the sewers, and the foul air, and the things that need never have killed anyone at all. The chart was designed, in her own words, to affect through the eyes. She had it printed 2,000 times and pressed into the hands of ministers who would never read 1,000 pages but could not, once they had looked, unsee the blue. It is exactly what the chapter is named for. A sermon preached in numbers. and she had engineered it, wedge by wedge, to convert. In 1858, the Statistical Society elected her a member, the first woman it had ever admitted, proposed by far. She would not have called it an honor, exactly. She would have called it a recognition of the obvious. For statistics, to her, was not a dry profession or a clever skill. It was, she said flatly, the most important science in the whole world, the one study without which all government, all administration of human lives, is merely guesswork dressed as decision. It is a strange thing to hear from a mystic. It is stranger still to realize she meant it as a creed. The woman who had tested God with a calendar as a child had grown into the woman who believed that the careful counting of the living and the dead was the nearest a human being could come to reading the intentions of heaven. And here the honest film has to stop and say the hard thing, because she would have wanted it said. The hospital she had run, the barrack hospital at Scutari, the place the whole legend was built on, had the worst death rate of any British hospital in the whole theater of the war. Worse than the field hospitals. Worse even than Balaclava. Across the war as a whole, something like 19,000 men died of disease against 4,000 of their wounds. The killer was never chiefly the fighting. It was the buildings, the sewers, the foul rationed water, and the rationed air. And the great fall in the dying at Scutari came not from the nursing, but from March 1855. After the sanitary commission arrived and flushed the drains and lime-washed the walls, a commission she had not sent, working on a cause she later admitted she had been, at the time, entirely in the dark about. That fact was so dangerous to her legend that Sidney Herbert kept it out of the public report to protect her, and it stayed buried for several generations. The historians have never agreed on what to make of it. Some read it as a guilt deliberately turned into a lifetime of atonement. One read it almost as fraud, and another, going back to all the papers, answers that this is simply to shoot the messenger, that the defects had been reported months before she ever arrived and covered up by others, and that it was her own analysis, in the end, that proved what the building had done. The argument is still open. We will not close it for you here. But there is one version of it she settled, because she settled it with her own life. She could have taken the Angel of the Crimea story whole. The whole nation was holding it out to her, finished, gilded, hers for the keeping. All she had to do was accept the comfort of it. She refused. She spent 50 years and the full force of her own genius proving exactly why her men had really died, knowing the whole time that the proof pointed back at the very hospital that had made her famous. That is the thing the lamp leaves out. She would not be soothed by a legend she knew to be false, and so she turned the refusal itself into a science, and the science went on to save hundreds of thousands of lives she would never meet. The contradiction is the heroism. The grief did not become a memory, and it did not become a shrine. The data was the penance. Chapter 6. The Cost of Her Will. The same will that had knelt all night by the dying at Scutari now turned on the living who served her, and drove the men she loved best into early graves. Before the cost, it is only fair to set down what the cost was for. She had understood, very early, the thing that defeats most reformers, that a report, however true, changes nothing by itself. Reports, she wrote, are not self-executive, so she made herself the executive. Through Sidney Herbert, she drove the recommendations into brick and into law. The barracks warmed and ventilated, and given water and gas where there had been none. An army medical school founded, a cook's school, a corps of hospital orderlies, a statistical branch keeping, for the first time, an annual report on the health of the army. And the plainest measure of it, in Herbert's 3 years at the War Office, only half as many men died each year at the home stations as had died before. The will worked. It saved, quietly, in peacetime, more lives than the lamp ever had. And that is what makes everything that follows a tragedy rather than merely a cruelty. And the work outlasted nearly everyone who knew it was hers. The cost accounting system she devised for the Army Medical Services was still in use 80 years later. In 1947, a select committee, wanting to know who had first thought of it, asked and was told it had been Miss Nightingale. The instrument of all this was Sidney Herbert. Her master, she called him, the one man whose hands could turn her arithmetic into orders. And in December 1860, the doctors found that Herbert had incurable kidney disease. She would not let herself believe he was dying. She and his wife together pressed the failing man to stay on at the War Office, to see the reorganization through before he stopped, because the work was unfinished, and there was no one else who could carry it. He stayed. He worked. It was said, afterward, that she had forced him to sign his own death warrant. And she did not relent as he sank. Even near the end, when his strength was failing in the bureaucratic fight he could no longer win, she wrote to him without mercy, "The Sidney Herbert beaten by Ben Hawes is a greater humiliation than the disaster of Scutari." Sidney Herbert died at Wilton in the early morning of 2 August 1861. His last words turned toward her and toward the thing they had built and not finished. "Poor Florence," he said, "our joint work unfinished." She collapsed when the news reached her. She had never married him, never been more to him in the world's eyes than a colleague. And yet she called herself, after this, his true widow, and said she knew of no widow more desolate than she was. And then she did the rarest thing she ever did. She admitted that she had been wrong with him. "I too was hard on him," she wrote. "And at the same time, he knew that what I said was true." The grief and the self-knowledge arrived in the same breath. She had spent him, and she knew she had spent him, and she could not, even then, say that the work had not been worth it. And it was not one man, and it was not only Herbert. Dr. Alexander, the Director General she had made, had died suddenly the year before. He died of overwork, they said. And 3 months after Herbert was gone, so was Arthur Hugh Clough, a poet married to her cousin, who had become her unpaid secretary and copied her endless tables and ran her errands and addressed her parcels, a fine and gentle mind hardest, as one description had it, like a racehorse to a coal truck. He died in Florence that November, worn out at 42, and his family blamed her for hastening the end. The pattern was plain enough to see once you looked for it. The people who came closest to her work did not last. No one ever judged her for this as harshly as she judged herself. Looking back across that year, across the 2 deaths, she wrote the most exact and unsparing thing anyone ever said about what she did to the people she worked with. "I felt," she said, "like a vampire who had sucked Sidney Herbert's and Cloud's blood. Now hardly a man remained," she added, "of all those she had worked with through those 5 years. I survived them all." It would be a comfort to call this a second Florence Nightingale, a tyrant who lived alongside the angel. It was not. It was the same woman and the same gift. A friend had seen it years before any of this, before Scutari even, that she had, in the writer's words, an intense love for the race, and yet a want of love for individuals, that she would have put all the children of England into well-run nurseries, the rich along with the poor, and thought it kindness. There it was, named early and exactly. The very faculty that let her hold 19,000 dead soldiers in her mind as a fact she could act on was the faculty that could let the single man at the next desk be used until he broke. Compassion that refuses to grow sentimental was her genius. Compassion that has stopped feeling the one person in front of it was the same thing, gone wrong. Once, in Egypt, it failed her outright. She looked at the poor she could not help, and felt something close to disgust, and heard some stones fall, and hoped it was they. That is the floor of what she was capable of, and it belongs in the account beside the kneeling and the lamp, because it was the same will, and she never pretended otherwise. From a single room she rarely left, by nothing more than pen and paper, she reached across the world. For the second half of her long life, the whole of her empire fit inside one room, a single room at South Street in Mayfair. The first thing a visitor noticed was that the windows had no curtains, for she was fanatical about ventilation and kept them flung open to the air she half worshipped, even in the cold. The second thing they noticed were the cats. There were 4 of them, sometimes 6, and they wandered the bed and the papers as she worked, leaving what one observer called unseemly blurs of ink across the pages of state. And she named them, dryly, for her preoccupations. One she called Muff, for the incompetence of the War Office, and one she called Mr. Bismarck. On the walls hung reproductions of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and in the middle of it all lay a stout, propped woman who never walked and seldom went out. And from this one quiet room, she ran 2 royal commissions, mastered a subcontinent she would never see, and reached, by correspondence alone, into the lives of soldiers and paupers, a world away. It was, almost literally, an empire run from a sickbed. She was asked more than once why a woman of such formidable energy lived as a recluse, and her answer was characteristically cold and exact. "It is entirely the effect of calculation," she said. "I cannot live to work unless I give up all that makes life pleasant." The illness was almost certainly real. The modern reading is a chronic infection, a brucellosis caught in the Crimea, organic and lasting, though the cause is debated to this day and may never be settled. And at the same time, with a candor that is entirely her own, the invalid's bed was also a wall she had built deliberately around her work, a way of refusing the dinners and the callers and the demands of family, of keeping every hour for the cause. both things were true at once: the real disease and the chosen fortress, which is about as Nightingale a fact as the record holds. From that room, in the last days of 1859, she sent out a small book that would reach further than any of her reports. It was called Notes on Nursing, and it was meant not for the trained nurse, but for the ordinary woman keeping watch over the sick at home. Hints for thought. She called it by no means a manual to teach nurses to nurse. It sold 15,000 copies within a month, and against the soft and flattering idea of the age, that nursing came naturally to any tender woman. She set down one of the coldest sentences she ever wrote. "It has been said," she wrote, "that every woman makes a good nurse. I believe, on the contrary, that the very elements of nursing are all but unknown. Care," she was saying, "was not a feeling you were born with. It was a discipline that had to be learned." A year before that, in her work on hospitals themselves, she had laid down a principle so plain it should never have needed saying, and so unmet that it had to be. "It may seem a strange principle to enunciate," she wrote, "as the very first requirement in a hospital, that it should do the sick no harm. Read it slowly, and the quiet horror in it surfaces that a building meant to heal could, and routinely did, kill the people brought into it by its crowding and its foul air and its want of light." Almost everything she fought for the rest of her life, lived inside that single understated line. And on the 9th of July, 1860, she did the thing that would outlast every report she wrote. With a public fund of some £45,000, raised in gratitude for the Crimea, she opened the Nightingale Training School at St. Thomas's Hospital. 15 candidates that first year, a brown uniform, a year of training, the probationers living together in a home of their own. It was not the first school of its kind, and she never pretended that it was. But it was the first to be open to women of any religion or none. The first to treat nursing not as the charity of the pious or the refuge of the disreputable, but as a decent, well-paid, respectable profession, open on the plain basis of merit, regardless of a woman's class. The angel idea she had spent her life resisting, what she built instead was a trade with standards that a woman could enter on her own ability and live by. But the largest thing she ever moved, she moved without leaving the bed, and across a distance she would never travel. She turned her attention to India, to the health of the British Army stationed across the subcontinent, and she mastered it entirely from London. She never went. A friend said that if she had ever gone to India, it would have been like going home. So completely had she made it hers on paper. She devised a circular of inquiry and sent it to more than 200 stations, asking for 10 years of figures on every condition that bore on a soldier's life. And when the replies came back, there were so many of them that they filled, by the household's reckoning, 2 whole vans. The scholar Benjamin Jowett took to calling her the governess of the governor of India, though she preferred, with her dry humor, maid of all the dirty work. A subcontinent, governed in its sanitary detail from one curtainless room in Mayfair. What she found in those returns was a slaughter conducted in peacetime by neglect. The death rate among British soldiers in India had reached 69 for every 1,000 men, 3 times the rate at home, and most of it owed not to battle or to the climate, but to filthy water and fouled ground and bad air. She put the figure in the plainest terms she could find. A company out of every regiment, she wrote, has been sacrificed every 20 months, not killed in any war, spent quietly 20 months at a time by sewers and standing water, and the want of the simple sanitary measures she had spent her life learning to demand. When the great Indian report was finally finished, more than 2,000 pages of it, she did with the official Blue Book what she had once done with the dead of the Crimea. She made it impossible to look away from. Into her own section of it, she put woodcut illustrations, pictures, in a government report, where pictures had never been used before, drawn for her by her cousin, Hilary Bonham Carter, who was herself slowly dying of cancer, with the extra cost paid quietly out of her own purse. And when the government printed only 1,000 copies and seemed to her to wish the thing buried, she set members of parliament to applying for the reserved copies until the supply ran out, so that, as she put it, for the first time in history, there was a run on a Blue Book, a government report fought over and sold out, because she had made dry official figures into something a man could not help but see. And the numbers, over the years that followed, came down. The death rate among British soldiers in India, which had stood at 69 for every 1,000, had fallen to 20 by 1867 and to around 5 by the year 1911. 69 to 20 to 5. Sir Bartle Frere, who had governed in India and watched it happen, gave the plainest verdict anyone gave. Of the sanitary improvements in India, he said, 3/4 are due to Miss Nightingale, not soldiers she had ever seen, in a country she had never set foot in, kept alive across decades by a woman who never left her room, counted and saved by the careful arithmetic of someone who refused to let their deaths stay merely sad. And the same reach that crossed the world to India turned, in those same years, to the poorest people at home. The death of one pauper did it a man named Timothy Daly, who died in a London workhouse in conditions so wretched that she said, grimly, that she was much obliged to him for dying, because his death let her force the question into the open. From the moment a pauper becomes sick, she wrote, he ceases to be a pauper and becomes brother to the best of us. She sent her trained nurses into the workhouse infirmaries, into the great pauper wards where the sick poor were warehoused without care, and into the largest of them, the Brownlow Hill Infirmary at Liverpool, with its 1,000 and more beds. She sent a young woman named Agnes Jones. It is like Scutari over again, Agnes wrote back to her. 3 years later, worn out, Agnes Jones was dead of typhus, another fine life used up entirely in the work, the old pattern repeating even here in the reaching out to the least. And out of that fight came the thing that reached furthest of all. In 1867, the Metropolitan Poor Act was passed, an act that has been called the first explicit acknowledgement of the duty of the state to provide hospitals for the poor, and for which, the record says, Miss Nightingale was largely responsible. It is a quiet sentence, and an enormous one. The idea that a nation owes proper care to its sick poor as a matter of duty and not of charity begins, in English law, very near to that room in Mayfair, and a straight line, though a long one, runs from it toward the founded National Health Service nearly a century later. She did not, of course, find any of it sufficient. On the compromises the politicians made to the act, in the margin of her papers, she wrote a single word: humbug. Chapter 8. Too kind, too kind. The great worker, after 50 years spent over her papers, begins at last to lay down her work. She never let herself be made simple. In a long private essay, the one she called Cassandra, she wrote a sentence that women would still be quoting a century later, that passion, intellect, and moral activity have never, in a woman, all three been satisfied at once. And in the same life, in a letter to a friend, she could write that she was brutally indifferent to the wrongs or the rights of her own sex. She escaped the cage and had little patience for those she felt would not. Both of these were true of her at once, and we will not pretend to reconcile them. We are only here to set them down. For almost the whole of her life, she had been wrong about the deepest thing. She had built her entire science of cleanliness on the old idea of bad air, that disease rose from filth and foul smell, from the air itself going rotten, and when the germ theory came, the idea that living organisms, too small to see, were carrying the contagion. She resisted it for years, and then, somewhere around 1885, when the evidence had quietly and completely turned against her, she turned with it. This is the smallest and the surest proof of who she really was. A mystic would have defended the revelation. A saint of science would have been right from the start. She was neither. She was a woman who had promised to follow the evidence, and when it led somewhere she had not wanted to go, she followed it anyway. Of what holiness actually was, she had no doubt at all, and she said it as plainly near the end as she had ever said anything. The angels, she wrote, are not the ones who go about scattering flowers. The angels are the ones who, like the nurse, or the ward maid, or the scavenger, do the disgusting work. Her holiness, in the end, was a sanitary holiness. It was carried out in the carrying of slobs, and the scrubbing of floors, and the counting of the dead. And she would not have had it carried out in any other way. And the people went out of her life, one after another, the way a tide goes out. The men she had worked beside for 50 years, the allies and the secretaries and the doctors she had driven and loved and used up, were almost all of them dead before her. The line she had written long ago in the grief of that first terrible year has simply gone on, coming true. She survived them all. Her mother, who had once been terrified of her, who had wept and forbidden and stood in her way, went blind and childish at the last, and Florence took her in and cared for her at Lea Hurst, and noted, without bitterness now, that at 60 years of age, her mother was free. The girl who had once seen nothing desirable but death was outliving everyone, sitting among the empty chairs and the portraits of the gone, the survivor of her own long war. And then, in the summer of 1890, something happened that has happened for almost no one else who lived in her century. Her actual voice was recorded onto one of Edison's wax cylinders for a fund for the survivors of the Light Brigade, so that across all the years between us and her, we can still hear her speak. Listen. The willowy girl who had once been measured against a doorframe at nearly 5 feet 8 had become, by the end, a dignified, stout old lady with a large, good-humored face. One visitor thought she looked rather like Gladstone. The fierce, watchful eyes were failing. By her 80s, she was almost entirely blind. "I have no eyes," she said, and she hid it as long as she could, having papers read aloud to her as though she were only resting them. And in the gentle confusion of her last years, she would sometimes ask for friends who had been dead for 30 years, for Sir Harry Verney, as though they might still come up the stairs. The most ferocious mind of her age was going out, slowly and softly, and without complaint. In November of 1907, the king conferred on her the Order of Merit. It was the highest honor in his gift, and she was the first woman in history ever to receive it. The king had at first been opposed to giving the order to a woman at all. The medal was brought to her room, but she had gone too far now to understand what it was, or why these grave men had come, and she said only of the thing the whole nation had wanted to give her for 50 years. Too kind, too kind. The honor had arrived. At last, just after the woman it was meant for had quietly left the room. She had never, for one day of her life, believed the legend they had built. The lady with the lamp belonged to the nation. She belonged to the dead she had counted, and the persistence of the bright, gentle figure on the prints and the postcards was not a comfort to her, but a quiet, lifelong torment. And so the line that she wrote of herself, long ago and meant for no one, comes back now and means, at the end, everything it meant at the beginning. The lady with the lamp shall stand. The lamp shows me only my utter shipwreck. She died at home in London on the 13th of August, 1910, aged 90. She died quietly, a little after noon, and did not wake again. And the strange and gentle thing is what she had come to feel about living in those last soft years, after a whole lifetime spent at the altar of the dead. There is so much to live for, she had written. Life is more precious to me now in my old age. The fierce will that had refused rescue on a Crimean hillside, that had driven good men into early graves, that had moved armies and a subcontinent from a single curtainless room, had at the very last only this to say that the world was worth staying in. And then it laid down its work. Her family declined the national funeral and the place that was offered her in Westminster Abbey. She had asked for the simplest possible burial, and she got it. In the family grave at the little church of East Wellow, in Hampshire, beside her mother and her father. The headstone carries no name at all. It says only F.N., born 1820, died 1910. And so we can say plainly, in our own voice, what the whole hour has been quietly building toward. Her real monument was never the lamp, and it was never the legend she could not bear. Her real monument is a system, the trained nurse, the clean hospital that does the sick no harm, the duty of a state to care for its poor, and it is arguably true that the health service a whole nation would build in 1948 is inconceivable without the changes she set in motion from the 1860s. Her gift was not tenderness. Her gift was a refusal to be comforted. She would not let her grief for the dying stay a feeling, and so she turned it, year after year, into the arithmetic that rebuilt how a nation cares for its sick. She was not the angel of the picture. She was the woman who refused to be one, and who found, as the man who knew her papers best, once wrote, "No use at all for angels without hands."